The story begins in the heart of a bustling metropolis, a city teeming with ambition, diversity, and its fair share of shadows. Beneath the glittering skyline and the hum of progress, the Metropolitan Police Department stands as both protector and, for some, perpetrator. Recent scandals have painted the force in shades of corruption, misconduct, and abuse of power, eroding public trust. Against this backdrop, we meet Officer Savannah Mitchell, a young, ambitious rookie eager to rise through the ranks. Her confidence borders on arrogance, fueled by a deep-seated belief in her abilities and an unyielding desire to prove herself. Savannah's world is defined by a rigid sense of right and wrong, shaped more by ambition than justice. She thrives on recognition and validation, often ignoring the nuances and complexities of the cases she encounters. This single-minded drive has earned her both admiration from her superiors and quiet resentment from her peers, who see her as reckless and overly self-assured. The story sets its focus on a pivotal moment in Savannah's career, the arrest of Darnell Washington, a young man from a marginalized community. Savannah believes Darnell is involved in a recent string of robberies, and her determination to make an example of him blinds her to the lack of concrete evidence. In her mind, the arrest is another notch in her belt, a demonstration of her effectiveness as an officer. However, for those around her, it's a troubling display of bias and overreach. As Savannah marches Darnell into custody, the tension is palpable. Her colleagues exchange uneasy glances, aware that the case against him is weak. In stark contrast, Savannah is confident in her actions, dismissing any doubts with a self-assured smile. Meanwhile, across the city, Judge Marcus Carter watches the growing mistrust in law enforcement with a heavy heart. Known for his unwavering integrity and dedication to justice, Judge Carter has built a reputation as a fair and impartial figure in a system riddled with flaws. His path will soon intersect with Savannah's in a confrontation that will not only challenge her career, but also force her to confront the deeper issues within the institution she serves. This is a story of ambition, accountability, and the cost of ignoring the line between confidence and arrogance. As the scene is set, the stage is ready for a dramatic unraveling of truths and a journey toward justice. If you enjoy this story, please support it by giving it a like and subscribing to stay updated with the latest chapters. Your support means everything. The city of New York, often seen as a beacon of justice and order, had long struggled with the systemic corruption festering within its ranks. The Metropolitan Police Department, once a symbol of law and order, had become a playground for those with power, where personal vendettas, biases, and agendas distorted the concept of justice. Among the officers tasked with maintaining this order was Officer Savannah Mitchell, a rookie with an unyielding ambition to climb the ranks. She was a woman driven by the thirst for success, yet her arrogance often overshadowed her sense of integrity. Savannah's ambition wasn't solely driven by a desire to serve. It was fueled by a need to prove herself. To her, the badge represented more than just a responsibility. It was an entryway into a world of recognition, respect, and the admiration she desperately sought. However, the department was full of seasoned officers, some of whom had long forgotten their duty to uphold justice and instead had become mired in corrupt practices. Savannah, eager to prove herself, aligned with their values, adopting a by any means necessary mentality that would later prove to be her undoing. Judge Marcus Carter, on the other hand, was a figure who stood in stark contrast to Savannah's worldview, a man of unwavering principles and integrity. Judge Carter had earned his reputation as a stalwart defender of fairness and justice. His track record was one of impartiality, and his courtroom was a space where justice wasn't just a concept but a hard, unyielding truth. The judge was known for his zero-tolerance stance on corruption within the police force, a policy that had earned him the respect of the public and the ire of those in power who had long since accepted the systemic decay. The tension between Savannah and Judge Carter began on a crisp autumn morning when Savannah, in her zeal to make her mark, apprehended Darnell Washington, a young black man, during a routine stop. Darnell, who had been minding his own business on his way to work, found himself caught up in a web of police misconduct. Savannah, driven by a mix of personal bias and a hunger for recognition, accused Darnell of involvement in a series of local robberies, a claim that had no basis in fact. Her actions, rooted in prejudice, were reckless, and she neglected to follow standard protocol. The arrest, though legal on paper, was a textbook example of how the system could be manipulated to suit one's own prejudices. The moment Darnell's family caught wind of the wrongful arrest, they knew they had to act. Darnell was a hard-working young man, well-respected in his community, and the charges leveled against him were not just absurd. They were an affront to his character. His mother, in a frantic attempt to free her son, sought the help of Marcus Williams, a seasoned attorney who had spent years battling the injustices within the city's legal system. Williams, known for his relentless pursuit of justice, immediately took on the case. The stage was now set for a legal showdown that would pit the unrelenting force of the judicial system against the arrogance and corruption within the police force. As the case began to unravel, it quickly became clear that the stakes were much higher than the fate of one officer and one innocent man. Savannah's actions began to raise uncomfortable questions about the broader issues within the police department, issues that Judge Carter had been warning about for years. His courtroom became the battleground for the battle between the forces of justice and the entrenched corruption within the system. Judge Carter, with his sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to truth, had long suspected that the department was rife with misconduct. He had seen firsthand how officers like Savannah, motivated by personal ambition, could tarnish the reputation of the entire force. But he also knew that his position as a judge could not be a passive one. He had to take action, even if it meant challenging the powerful institutions that ran the city. When Savannah stood before Judge Carter for the first time, she had no idea the magnitude of the conflict she was about to enter. She was used to bending the rules to her advantage, used to manipulating situations to serve her ambitions. But Judge Carter was a man who demanded accountability. His court was a place where no one, not even the police, was above the law. During their first confrontation, Savannah's arrogance was evident. She had little regard for the judge's reputation, and her response to his questioning was dismissive, as if she believed her status as an officer would shield her from scrutiny. "Your Honor," she said, her tone sharp and condescending. "I was doing my job. The arrest was necessary to maintain order." Judge Carter, unshaken by her defiant tone, leaned forward in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on Savannah. "Officer Mitchell," he replied, his voice steady but firm, "you may have followed procedure, but that does not excuse prejudice. Your actions have consequences far beyond this case. This isn't just about one man's innocence. It's about a systemic issue that's been allowed to fester in your department for far too long." Savannah, not used to being challenged in such a direct manner, bristled at his words. She had become accustomed to the silence that surrounded her within the department, where most officers turned a blind eye to the corruption around them. But Judge Carter was different. He was a man of principles, a man who wasn't afraid to shine a light on the darkness. Their exchanges would become increasingly tense as the case progressed. Savannah, in her attempts to justify her actions, would often clash with Judge Carter's uncompromising stance on justice. The courtroom became a stage for a battle of wills, with Savannah desperately trying to hold on to the belief that she was in the right, while Judge Carter relentlessly pushed for the truth to come to light. As the case evolved, it became clear that Savannah was not just facing a legal battle. She was up against the very system she had been a part of. And in Judge Marcus Carter, she had met her match, someone who would not allow the corruption within the police force to continue unchecked. The morning of Darnell Washington's arrest began like any other. He woke up early, had breakfast with his mother, and set off to his job at the local hardware store. Darnell was a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself, trying to stay out of trouble and make an honest living. He had no criminal record, no history of violent behavior, and no reason to fear the police. But on this particular morning, Darnell's life would be irrevocably altered by the actions of one officer, Officer Savannah Mitchell. Savannah, eager to prove herself in a department where corruption ran deep and personal biases often dictated decisions, had spent weeks on edge. striving to meet the expectations set by her superiors. She was still relatively new to the force, and her ambition often clouded her judgment. In her mind, a quick arrest would secure her reputation among her colleagues and make her a standout figure in a department desperate for results. But in her haste to make a name for herself, she overlooked one crucial element: the truth. It began as a routine patrol in the south side of the city, an area that had seen an uptick in crime over the past few months. Savannah, her mind racing with the pressure to make an arrest, noticed Darnell walking along the sidewalk, seemingly in a hurry. He was carrying a small duffel bag, and his pace quickened as he noticed her police cruiser. In that moment, Savannah's mind, already clouded by the fear of missing out on her breakthrough, snapped to conclusions that were, in hindsight, entirely unfounded. Without just cause or probable suspicion, Savannah decided to approach Darnell. She quickly exited the vehicle and called out to him, her voice stern. Darnell, startled and confused, stopped in his tracks. His hands instinctively moved to his pockets, but he didn't make any threatening moves. He had done nothing wrong. However, Savannah, assuming the worst, immediately accused him of being involved in a string of recent robberies, pointing to his quickened pace as evidence of his guilt. Her accusations were based on nothing more than a gut feeling, a sense of suspicion that had no solid foundation. When Darnell protested, trying to explain that he was simply on his way to work, Savannah's frustration only grew. She failed to listen to his explanation, her mind already made up. In her eyes, Darnell's reaction to being stopped by the police was an admission of guilt. She ordered him to place his hands behind his back, and within moments, he was handcuffed and forced into the back of her cruiser. Savannah, blinded by her own assumptions and the pressure to succeed, failed to realize that she had just wrongfully detained an innocent man. The news of the arrest spread quickly. By the time Savannah returned to the station with Darnell in tow, the city was already beginning to buzz with the implications of what had transpired. Her colleagues, used to turning a blind eye to the minor injustices that occurred every day, were nonetheless taken aback by the blatant nature of the arrest. They had seen officers use their power for personal gain before, but this was different. Savannah had arrested a man with no real evidence, simply because of her own biases. Darnell's family, who had already received word of his detention, wasted no time in seeking justice. His mother, distraught by the news, went straight to attorney Marcus Williams, a seasoned lawyer known for his no-nonsense approach to fighting police corruption. She was desperate for someone who could help her son and put an end to the injustice he had faced. She knew Darnell was innocent, and she wasn't about to let a system so deeply flawed ruin his future. Attorney Williams, upon hearing the details of the arrest, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. He was familiar with the corruption that ran through the ranks of the police department, and this case was a textbook example of how an officer's personal biases could lead to devastating consequences. He began working tirelessly to secure Darnell's release and to build a case that would expose Savannah's actions for what they truly were: a blatant misuse of power. As Darnell sat in a holding cell, waiting for his chance to defend himself, the ripples of his arrest began to spread throughout the legal system. It wasn't long before the story of his wrongful detention caught the attention of Judge Marcus Carter, a man known for his staunch stance on holding the police accountable for their actions. Judge Carter, who had been hearing whispers about Savannah's behavior for months, decided to take an active role in the case. He was no stranger to corruption within the police force, but this case, this young officer's reckless actions, struck a nerve. He knew that if the system allowed someone like Savannah to go unchecked, it would send a dangerous message to every officer in the city. The consequences for Savannah, however, were not immediate. Despite the mounting evidence against her, she believed that the system would protect her. After all, she was a police officer, a part of the institution that was supposed to maintain order and uphold justice. She had never seriously questioned the ethics of her actions before. She had always justified them by telling herself that she was doing her job. But as the case began to unfold, she quickly realized that this time, her actions had gone too far. Darnell, once released, was left to deal with the psychological scars of being wrongfully arrested. The trauma of being treated as a criminal, despite his innocence, would haunt him for months to come. His reputation in the community had been tarnished, and though the charges against him would eventually be dropped, the emotional toll was immeasurable. His family stood by him, but the damage had already been done. The public humiliation, the indignity of being unjustly accused, could not simply be erased by a legal victory. As for Savannah, the initial consequences of her actions were not as severe as they should have been. She continued to wear her badge with a sense of entitlement, convinced that her position within the department would shield her from real accountability. But her arrogance, her disregard for the well-being of the very people she was sworn to protect, was about to catch up with her, and the path that lay ahead would force her to confront the truth in ways she could never have anticipated. The moments following Darnell's arrest were chaotic and emotionally draining for his family. His mother, Clara Washington, had raised her son with love and care, always teaching him to work hard, stay out of trouble, and treat everyone with respect. She could never have imagined a scenario where her son, an innocent, hardworking man, would be wrongfully detained and treated as a criminal by those sworn to protect him. Clara was beside herself, the weight of disbelief and frustration pressing down on her. Clara knew something had to be done. She had heard whispers of police misconduct over the years. But this was different. This wasn't just another case of a minor infraction. It was a blatant abuse of power. She couldn't sit idly by while her son's future was put at risk by a mistake, a misjudgment, or worse, an intentional act of corruption. She immediately reached out to her network of friends and family, hoping to find someone who could help her navigate the legal system and fight back against the injustice that had been thrust upon her family. The first call she made was to Marcus Williams, a well-respected attorney in the city who had a reputation for taking on tough cases. Marcus had spent years fighting against corruption within the local justice system, and he had made a name for himself by going up against the police and holding them accountable when they overstepped their bounds. He had built a career out of defending people who had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And when Clara called, he knew this case was one he couldn't ignore. When Clara arrived at Marcus's office, her eyes were red from crying, and her voice trembled as she recounted the events of the morning. She described Darnell's arrest, the way Officer Savannah Mitchell had approached him without cause, and how he had been treated with disrespect and hostility, despite having done nothing wrong. Clara's words were filled with the raw emotion of a mother who could not fathom how something so unjust could happen to her son. Marcus listened intently, absorbing every detail, already formulating a plan in his mind. He could hear the pain in Clara's voice, but he also heard the resolve. She wasn't going to let this go quietly. Neither would he. Marcus immediately set to work. He knew that time was of the essence. Every minute Darnell spent in detention without a clear reason for his arrest made it harder to build a strong case. He started by gathering evidence. First, he made sure that Darnell's release was expedited. It wasn't long before Darnell was out of jail, but Marcus knew that the battle was just beginning. The charges might be dropped eventually, but the damage had already been done. The arrest, the humiliation, and the emotional toll on Darnell were not something that could be easily erased. The next step was to secure concrete evidence of the wrongful arrest. Marcus began by reviewing any available surveillance footage from the area where Darnell had been stopped. He knew that in today's world, nearly every street corner and business had some form of surveillance, and he was determined to find footage that could prove Savannah's actions were both unjustified and discriminatory. To his surprise, he quickly uncovered a clear video recording of the incident, showing Darnell walking down the sidewalk, peacefully minding his business. When Savannah approached him without any reasonable suspicion or cause, the footage painted a clear picture. Darnell had been harassed, profiled, and detained without justification. In addition to the video evidence, Marcus began reaching out to potential witnesses who may have seen the encounter. He spoke to neighbors, people who lived in the area, and others who might have been around when the incident occurred. Several people came forward, corroborating Darnell's version of events, further strengthening the case. Marcus's team was quickly assembling a solid foundation of evidence that could expose Officer Mitchell's actions and hold her accountable for her role in the wrongful arrest. With the evidence in hand, Marcus turned his attention to the legal avenues available to Darnell. He knew that a civil lawsuit could be filed against Officer Mitchell for the false arrest and the emotional distress she had caused. But he also knew that the case was much bigger than just one officer. It was a reflection of a broken system, one that allowed police officers to operate without accountability. He had been down this road before. Fighting systemic issues like corruption within the police force was never easy. But Marcus was no stranger to difficult cases. At the same time, Clara was becoming increasingly vocal about her son's case. She knew that the legal battle was only part of the equation. She needed to ensure that the public knew what had happened, that people understood the devastating impact of a wrongful arrest. Clara reached out to local media outlets, telling Darnell's story and demanding justice. She appeared in interviews, expressing her outrage over how the police had treated her son, and calling for a change in the way law enforcement handled interactions with innocent civilians, especially in communities of color. Her voice, though filled with anger and pain, was also one of resilience and determination. The media attention began to mount, and as more people learned about Darnell's case, the pressure on the local police department grew. The public was outraged by what they saw as a blatant act of injustice, and the story quickly gained traction on social media. The more Clara spoke out, the more people supported her, sharing her message and demanding action from the authorities. Darnell's case was now at the forefront of public consciousness, and the momentum was shifting. Marcus, with his legal expertise, and Clara, with her unyielding determination, had ignited a movement that would not be easily ignored. It wasn't just about Darnell anymore. It was about justice for every person who had been wrongfully targeted, mistreated, or harmed by the system. As Marcus prepared to take on the legal battle, he knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But one thing was clear: Darnell's family and his lawyer were not going to back down. They had the evidence, the support of the community, and most importantly, the truth on their side. And they were ready to make sure that Officer Mitchell and the entire department knew that they would be held accountable for their actions. The courtroom was packed with anticipation. The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone knew this trial would be far from ordinary. Darnell Washington, once a nameless face in the sea of injustice, was now at the center of a case that could reverberate through the city's legal system and bring long-needed reforms to the Metropolitan Police Department. With his mother Clara sitting nervously in the front row and his attorney Marcus Williams beside him, Darnell was preparing to face the very officers who had wronged him. And at the center of the controversy stood Officer Savannah Mitchell. Savannah Mitchell had never expected to find herself in this position. The confident rookie cop, whose ambition had once driven her to make bold decisions, now sat nervously at the defense table. She had always prided herself on following the rules, believing that the badge she wore granted her the authority to act with impunity. Yet here she was, her every action being scrutinized under the harsh light of public attention and legal examination. As the proceedings began, the realization hit her hard. The walls were closing in, and she might not walk away from this unscathed. Judge Marcus Carter, known for his fairness and unyielding commitment to justice, presided over the trial. He had seen countless cases of police misconduct, but this one was different. The video footage that had surfaced showing Savannah's unjust treatment of Darnell was damning, and the evidence that Marcus Williams had gathered was undeniable. But there was more at stake here than just one wrongful arrest. It was about exposing a broken system that allowed officers to abuse their power without fear of accountability. The prosecution began its case with a strong opening statement, outlining the sequence of events that led to Darnell's wrongful arrest. The video footage was played for the courtroom, showing Darnell walking down the street, minding his own business when Officer Mitchell approached him. The footage clearly demonstrated that Darnell had not been involved in any criminal activity and had done nothing to warrant an arrest. Yet, despite the lack of any reasonable suspicion or cause, Savannah had escalated the situation, detaining Darnell and subjecting him to unnecessary humiliation and distress. As the footage played on the large screen, the courtroom fell silent. Even Savannah couldn't look away from the image of her actions on full display. She had hoped to escape the consequences of her decision, but the reality was now impossible to deny. The surveillance video was irrefutable proof of her misconduct, and it wasn't long before the weight of the evidence began to sink in. Marcus Williams, ever the master of legal strategy, wasted no time in cross-examining Savannah. He stood tall in front of her, calmly but assertively pressing her on every detail of the arrest. Savannah's answers were shaky, her confidence eroding with each question. At first, she tried to justify her actions, citing her years of training and the pressure she felt as a new officer on the force. But as Marcus continued, it became clear that her explanations were flimsy and unconvincing. "Officer Mitchell," Marcus began, his voice steady and controlled. "Can you explain why? In this video, we see you approaching Mr. Washington with no probable cause, no suspicion of any crime, and yet you detain him?" Savannah stammered. I thought he looked suspicious. He was walking away from a known crime area. And I thought he might be involved in something. But there was no evidence to support that claim. Was there?" Marcus pressed. "You acted solely on your personal judgment, not on any solid evidence or reasonable suspicion." Savannah shifted in her seat, her discomfort growing. She had hoped her actions would be overlooked, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Under the barrage of questioning, she began to unravel. The facade of competence she had once so confidently displayed began to crack, revealing the arrogance and bias that had guided her decisions that day. The turning point came when Judge Marcus Carter, having listened intently to the proceedings, decided to step in. Known for his no-nonsense approach, Judge Carter was a force to be reckoned with. He turned to Savannah with a look that was both stern and compassionate, a reflection of the burden he carried as a guardian of justice. "Officer Mitchell," he began, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "your actions on that day have not only harmed Mr. Washington, but they have also violated the very principles of justice that this courtroom upholds. You are not here simply to defend yourself. You are here to answer for the trust you have broken with the public, with the people you have sworn to protect." Savannah's face went pale, her defenses crumbling under the weight of the judge's words. It was in that moment that she realized she wasn't just on trial for her actions in that one incident. She was on trial for a pattern of behavior that many in the department had long turned a blind eye to. Her arrogance, her bias, her sense of entitlement had led her to a place where there was no escape. As the trial progressed, the defense attempted to cast doubt on the character of Darnell and his family, hoping to shift the blame onto them. But Marcus Williams was prepared. He countered every attempt with grace and precision, reinforcing the narrative that Savannah's actions were not just a mistake, but part of a larger systemic issue. He presented witnesses who spoke to the broader culture of corruption and racial profiling within the police department, showing that Darnell's arrest was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a much deeper problem. The weight of the evidence mounted as the day wore on. Savannah's downfall was not just about her own actions, but about exposing the systemic flaws that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. By the time the defense rested its case, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Savannah Mitchell was not going to walk away from this without facing the consequences of her actions. Judge Carter's final words before the court recessed echoed in Savannah's mind long after the trial had ended. He spoke of justice, accountability, and the importance of holding those in power to a higher standard. Savannah's heart sank as she realized the gravity of the situation. Her career, her reputation, and her freedom were all on the line. And as the gavel came down, marking the end of the day's proceedings, one thing was certain: Savannah Mitchell's fate had been sealed. As the trial against Officer Savannah Mitchell gained momentum, it became clear that this case was far more than just an individual failure. It was a pivotal moment for exposing a deeply ingrained culture of corruption within the Metropolitan Police Department. While the public focused on the wrongful arrest of Darnell Washington, the investigation quickly revealed that there were far more sinister layers to uncover. Darnell's case had inadvertently unearthed a systemic problem that had been festering for years. And now, the floodgates were open. Judge Marcus Carter, ever the vigilant advocate for justice, sensed that there was much more to this case than met the eye. As the trial continued, he called for a more in-depth investigation into the actions of the police department, What had started as a wrongful arrest investigation quickly expanded into a full-blown inquiry into the inner workings of the police force, with far-reaching consequences. It was during this phase that new evidence began to surface, revealing shocking truths about the conduct of Savannah Mitchell and her colleagues. Key pieces of evidence had been deliberately ignored or concealed, as though someone within the department had been trying to protect their own. Missing case files, manipulated reports, and hidden surveillance footage started to emerge, all pointing to a cover-up designed to shield the officers involved from scrutiny. The first piece of key evidence came from a former officer, Robert Harris, who had worked alongside Savannah Mitchell during her early days on the force. Harris, disillusioned with the system and seeking redemption for his own past misdeeds, came forward with startling revelations. He disclosed that there had been a pattern of racial profiling and unjust arrests orchestrated by certain officers within the precinct. Harris had witnessed firsthand how certain officers would target individuals based on their race or social status, planting evidence and falsifying reports to justify their actions. What's more, he claimed that these practices were well known within the department, and those who spoke out were quickly silenced or reassigned. The weight of Harris's testimony was staggering. His account, combined with other pieces of circumstantial evidence, painted a damning picture of widespread corruption. But it wasn't just about misconduct on the streets. It was about the internal processes that allowed such behavior to persist without accountability. Key documents, including internal memos and emails, were recovered from a hidden database, showing that many high-ranking officers had been aware of the misconduct and had chosen to ignore or, worse, support it. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Savannah Mitchell was not an isolated case. She was a product of a broken system, a system that had fostered an environment where officers were allowed to operate above the law, without fear of repercussion. The scandal that was unfolding threatened to shake the very foundations of the city's law enforcement. Judge Carter, determined to get to the bottom of the issue, appointed a special task force to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the corruption within the police department. This task force, made up of outside experts and independent investigators, was granted full access to departmental records, confidential files, and testimonies from both current and former officers. The task force's objective was clear: to root out the corruption that had taken hold of the force and to ensure that justice was served not just for Darnell, but for every victim who had been wronged by the department's abuses of power. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the confines of Savannah's case, reaching into the broader network of officers involved in misconduct. It was during this phase that the task force uncovered a deeply troubling pattern of systemic abuse. Surveillance footage from several incidents across different precincts revealed a chilling similarity in the way suspects, particularly young black men, were treated by officers. In many cases, these individuals had been wrongfully detained, beaten, or coerced into confessions, all under the guise of maintaining order in the streets. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from a former detective, Linda Foster, who had worked in the Internal Affairs Division for several years. Foster revealed that there had been multiple investigations into officer misconduct that had been quietly closed, with no public record of the inquiries ever having taken place. She spoke of how complaints from citizens were routinely ignored or swept under the rug, and how any attempt to investigate police misconduct was met with resistance from within the department. According to Foster, the department had long been aware of the corruption but had allowed it to continue unchecked due to the culture of silence that pervaded the force. The revelations sent shockwaves throughout the city. Public trust in the police, already fragile after years of tense relations with the community, was now in freefall. Protests erupted in the streets, demanding justice not only for Darnell, but for all those who had been victimized by the system. As the investigation deepened, more and more people came forward with stories of abuse and corruption, painting a picture of a department that had lost its way and was now in desperate need of reform. Judge Carter, who had always maintained his belief in the importance of law and order, found himself grappling with the harsh reality of a broken system. The magnitude of what had been uncovered was staggering. He knew that the work of the task force was just the beginning. The investigation had only scratched the surface, and there was still much to uncover. But what was clear now was that Savannah Mitchell was not just a rogue officer. She was part of a larger, deeply entrenched network of corruption. As the revelations unfolded, Savannah found herself at the center of a storm she could no longer control. The walls were closing in on her, and she realized that the truth was far more damning than she could have ever anticipated. The deeper the investigation went, the more she understood that her actions, though horrific, were only a small part of the pervasive culture that had allowed such abuses to take place for so long. As the dust settled following the culmination of the trial and subsequent investigations, the city found itself at a crossroads. The revelations surrounding Officer Savannah Mitchell and the deeply ingrained corruption within the Metropolitan Police Department had irrevocably changed the landscape of law enforcement and public trust. What had started as an isolated case of misconduct had become a watershed moment for accountability, transparency, and reform. Judge Marcus Carter, whose steadfast commitment to justice had guided the entire process, stood at the forefront of the city's efforts to heal. He had been unwavering in his pursuit of truth, even when it meant confronting uncomfortable and difficult realities. The system, as it had existed for so long, was broken, and it was clear that rebuilding it would require more than just the removal of a few corrupt officers. It would require a complete overhaul of policies, procedures, and the culture within the police force. In his final ruling, Judge Carter addressed the court, the public, and the city's law enforcement community, delivering a powerful message that would resonate for years to come. He began by acknowledging the harm caused by the actions of officers like Savannah Mitchell. He expressed his regret over the number of lives that had been affected by the misconduct, lives that had been forever altered by the wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and abuse of power. But he also emphasized that this was not just a matter of individual wrongdoings. The problem, he stated, was systemic, and it was time for the entire department to be held accountable for the culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive. The truth is, Judge Carter said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, this is not just about one officer's mistakes. This is about a system that failed its citizens, a system that allowed these abuses to go unchecked for far too long. And it is our duty to make sure that we never allow this to happen again. As he continued, Judge Carter laid out a series of sweeping reforms aimed at ensuring that the Metropolitan Police Department would never again fall into the same trap of corruption and abuse. These reforms included mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review police conduct, and a restructuring of the Internal Affairs Division to ensure that complaints against officers were investigated thoroughly and without bias. Additionally, the department was required to implement a public transparency initiative, where records of police misconduct and disciplinary actions would be made available to the public on a regular basis. Perhaps most importantly, Judge Carter ordered the creation of a new community policing model, one that emphasized collaboration between law enforcement and the communities they served. This model would focus on building trust, promoting mutual respect, and prioritizing de-escalation tactics over aggressive law enforcement methods. The goal was to change the very nature of policing, shifting from a mentality of us versus them to one of partnership and shared responsibility. For Savannah Mitchell, the consequences of her actions were grave. She was dismissed from the police force, stripped of her badge and authority. In a public statement, she expressed remorse for the harm she had caused, but it was clear that the damage was done. Her career was over, and the public shaming was only the beginning of the consequences she would face. Savannah's actions had ignited a series of events that led to the downfall of an entire department, and her name would forever be associated with the scandal that had rocked the city. Yet, Savannah's downfall was not the end of the story. It was, in fact, the beginning of a new chapter for the city. The trial and investigation had been a wake-up call, a reminder that no one, not even those in positions of power, were above the law. The public's response to the case was mixed, but many felt that the reforms enacted by Judge Carter were a necessary step in the right direction. They understood that while accountability was important, it was equally crucial to build a system that was capable of preventing future injustices from occurring. for Darnell Washington and his family. The trial was a bittersweet victory. Darnell, whose life had been upended by the wrongful arrest, found solace in the fact that the truth had come to light and that the police department would be held accountable. His mother, too, felt a sense of relief, knowing that her son's case had played a pivotal role in uncovering the corruption within the force. But both understood that the real victory was not just in the legal outcome. It was in the hope that the reforms would lead to a better, fairer society for everyone, particularly for those who had long been marginalized by a flawed system. In the aftermath of the trial, the community began to heal. Protests gradually subsided as people turned their attention to the work of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the public. The road to reform would not be easy, but the foundation had been laid. The case of Darnell Washington had become a symbol of both the deep flaws in the justice system and the power of the people to demand change. It showed that when individuals, families, and communities came together, they could challenge even the most entrenched systems of power and make a difference. As the city moved forward, the lessons learned from Savannah Mitchell's downfall were not forgotten. The reforms enacted were a testament to the importance of accountability, transparency, and the commitment to ensuring that justice was not just a privilege for a few, but a right for all. The case of Darnell Washington, while tragic, ultimately served as a turning point, a moment when the system was forced to confront its flaws and take meaningful steps toward healing. Judge Carter's final words, delivered with resolute determination, summed up the spirit of the reforms. This is not just a victory for justice, it is a victory for humanity. We must always strive to do better, to be better, and we must ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated.